Hello, my fellow Plutonians, and welcome back to my channel. Welcome to part 2 of looking into the Jordan Chandler versus Michael Jackson case of 1993. If you haven't watched part 1, then please do so. We deal with the chronology of events that led up to the allegations and the settlement. So if you're not too aware of the background, then it is imperative that you check that video out first. If you're very familiar with the facts of this case, then feel free to stay for the remainder of this video because you're pretty much caught up on everything that you need to know. In this video, we're going to be looking at the settlement itself. Now, a quick disclaimer, we won't be looking at every single clause in detail because that would be quite tedious. It's quite a lengthy settlement. It's linked down below. We're only going to be examining the parts that are more pertinent to the issues that have arisen as a result of the settlement. Namely, the very wide belief held by most people that Michael Jackson, by signing this settlement and paying the money, has admitted guilt. This is the biggest fallacy surrounding not just this settlement, but civil settlements all over the world. Another quick disclaimer I'd like to state that I should have also mentioned in the first video is that I'm not a civil litigation lawyer, so this isn't my area of expertise. For those of you who have been following me for a while, may know by now that I am predominantly experienced in military law. I do have some exposure to criminal law as well, but I pretty much joined the military right after graduating law school. So please bear that in mind when watching this video. That's not to say I don't know what I'm talking about. I would never presume to make a video about an area that I know nothing about. It's just that I've never actually been involved in settlements. So I know how to read them and interpret them, but I'm not an absolute authority in the area. All right, so as we all know, Jordan Chandler was only 14 years old when this settlement was entered into, and so he was a minor. Officially, the settlement is between him and Michael Jackson, but because of his status as a minor at the time, his parents were his legal guardians, of course, and they were basically executing the settlement on his behalf. Reference is also made to the official civil complaint that was lodged by the Chandlers against Michael. And this is relevant specifically pertaining to the causes of action that they are alleging against Michael. And these are sexual battery, seduction, willful misconduct, intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and negligence in that order. So 1 to 7. And you'll understand why I'm naming them in order and numbering them, because that will be referenced later. Perhaps the most important clause in this settlement is clause number 2. This clause states that this confidential settlement shall not be construed as an admission by Jackson that he has acted wrongfully with respect to the minor, Evan Chandler or June Chandler, or any other person or at all, or that the minor, Evan Chandler or June Chandler, have any rights whatsoever against Jackson. Jackson specifically disclaims any liability to and denies any wrongful acts against the minor or his parents or any other persons. The parties acknowledge that Jackson is a public figure and that his name, image, and likeness have commercial value and are an important element of his earning capacity. The parties acknowledge that Jackson claims that he has elected to settle the claims in the action in view of the impact that it has had and could have in the future on his earnings and potential income. So this is twofold. First of all, this makes it very clear that Michael is in no way admitting guilt or any liability whatsoever by signing the settlement, and that he's basically only doing this to limit the damage that will continue to be done to his image, because he's an entertainer, he's a public figure, and he earns a living by means of being in the public eye. So his image was an incredibly important factor to his earning capacity. The reason I state that this is probably the most important clause is because this settlement has led the public to believe, of course, thanks to the media, that Michael was guilty and he was trying to pay off the accuser. So he was trying to buy his silence. Now, interestingly enough, Larry Feldman, the accuser's own lawyer, has publicly stated after the settlement was signed that no one has bought anyone's silence. Michael did not do this to silence him. And that belief was unfortunately one of the most damaging outcomes that have resulted out of this settlement. Which brings me to dispelling another very common myth surrounding settlements. People seem to think that criminals or alleged criminals can pay off their victims to silence them and to prevent them from ever going to the authorities and potentially initiating criminal proceedings against them. That is not legal. That is not possible in the law. So you can't use a civil settlement to protect yourself from criminal investigations and criminal proceedings. If that was the case, then can you imagine the number of people who could simply come up with some kind of settlement, as long as they have the money to pay off the victim, of course, to make sure that the victim cannot legally initiate criminal proceedings against them. It's ludicrous to even think that it's possible, but of course I understand that people who aren't in the legal profession and who listen to these things from the media can be led to believe that you can stop people from initiating criminal proceedings simply by having them sign a document. Harvey Weinstein's the most popular example, because we have many female celebrities coming out now saying they were made to sign NDAs. But that did not stop them from going to the authorities eventually and filing criminal complaints. Civil and criminal are two separate spheres for the most part. Sometimes they intertwine. So for example, let's say the Chandlers wanted to see Michael brought to justice in a criminal sense. They can then, after the conclusion of the criminal trial, and if he is found to be guilty, they can then sue him for all of the distress and the fraud and all these causes of actions that they have listed. So it's further compensation, monetary compensation, for the crime that the defendant committed. I hope I'm making myself clear here. So you cannot settle your way out of criminal consequences. That's not to say people don't try to do that. Of course they do, Harvey Weinstein being one of them. But it doesn't work. It's not legally sound. Most of the time, the trick is that the victim must be aware of this. So if the victim thinks and is misled into thinking that by signing this settlement or this NDA, they then cannot initiate criminal proceedings, then they probably won't. And that's the problem. We need to educate people about this. All right, now clause 3 deals entirely with the settlement payment, which includes, of course, the settlement amount and the breakdown, etc. Unfortunately, it is redacted from this version of the settlement that is publicly available. I have tried to look for an unredacted version, couldn't find one. If someone has one, then you can link it to me. The only amount that's been left unredacted is this amount that you can see here of just over $15 million. This is the amount that was accepted by both parties, including Michael, of course, in the form of a confession of judgment, which is basically a written agreement that the defendant accepts that this is the amount that they are liable to pay without having to go to court and go through that whole process of arguing whether the defendant should pay this specific amount or not. So it's like a shortcut. It's like, sure, you want this much. Here's a confession of judgment saying that I agree to pay this much. But since this is being referred to in this clause as the total amount, then this is presumably the total amount that was paid by Michael to Jordan Chandler. So all this talk of a $20 million settlement or a $23 million settlement was completely made up by the media, because that figure makes no appearance whatsoever in this settlement. Now, this clause states that the confession of judgment will be held in trust for Jordan. Not the money itself, just a copy of the confession of judgment. At least that's how this clause reads to me. So it says here that Michael will execute and deliver to Jordan's lawyers confessions of judgment to be held in trust by the attorneys, with no copies to be made or provided to any other person. This end bit, this end sentence, with no copies to be made, is what makes it quite clear to me that what is being held in trust is the actual confessions of judgment, not the money. Because you can't say with no copies of the money to be made, but you can say with no copies of the confession of judgment to be made. Another important clause I want to point out is 3G. It states that the parties recognize that the settlement payments set forth are in settlement of claims by Jordan Chandler and his parents for alleged personal injuries. The use of the word alleged is incredibly important, and it stood out to me like a sore thumb as someone who is trained to interpret these things. This further clarifies that Michael has not admitted to anything. These are all alleged. No finding of guilt has been made by a court of law. And in fact, at this time, there was no evidence against Michael, even in the criminal investigation. And then clause 4 says that the settlement payments shall constitute full and complete satisfaction and settlement of any and all claims against Jackson or any of the Jackson releasees. Jackson's releasees are defined in this settlement, but basically they include his companies, his heirs, his family, etc. And I'm pointing this one out just to clarify that, again, this doesn't mean that criminal investigations will be impeded by the settlement. This is purely with regards to further civil claims. So they are being barred from pursuing this any further, which brings us directly to the next clause, number 5, which deals with the dismissal of the action. So it states that the action shall be dismissed with prejudice in accordance with the following schedule. Upon signing the settlement, Evan and his guardians and his lawyers shall dismiss without prejudice the first 6 causes of action of the complaint, leaving only the 7th cause of action pending. This is why I listed the causes of action for you in the beginning. So the 7th cause of action is negligence. Now I'll explain very quickly what with and without prejudice is. With prejudice means the parties will no longer be able to bring this claim again ever in the future. Without prejudice basically is the opposite. A case is not dismissed forever. So the parties aren't barred from pursuing a case in the future. So this clause is saying when the settlement is signed, not when it's paid, when it's signed, then the Chandlers cannot pursue the first 6 causes of action without prejudice, meaning they're not permanently barred from doing so. And it left the 7th one of negligence pending. But then when you examine clause B, it states that once the full and complete payment of the settlement is made, then Evan, through his guardians and his lawyers, shall dismiss the entire action with prejudice, which means when the money is paid, all of the causes of action, 1 through 7, including negligence, will be permanently dismissed. And then clauses 6 and 7 just very quickly talk about how both parties basically irrevocably and unconditionally release, acquit, and forever discharge Michael and any of his releasees from any further claims in the future. As you can see here in the screenshot, it goes further than claims and complaints. It's very detailed. It also goes as far as to say any known or unknown, suspected or unsuspected, fixed or contingent. Basically, it covers everything. So once the settlement is executed, you both release each other of any liability in relation to this case or even future cases, of course, as long as they're not going to impede a criminal investigation, because you can't do that with civil settlements. All right, so there's one thing I glossed over in my video, which is strange because it was in my notes, which is about clauses 9 and 10. So basically these 2 clauses prohibit Michael and Jordan from profiting out of this and talking to the media or making any sort of deal or engagement with the media in any form, whether it was a book or a radio broadcast or an interview that directly relates to this case. So we talk about this a little bit later, and I even include an excerpt from the interview. But in 1996, Michael gave an interview to Diane Sawyer, and it was with Lisa Marie Presley. And Diane Sawyer asked him whether he had ever done anything to a child, including the minor in question, Jordan Chandler, but he wasn't named. And Michael just generally responded, "I've never harmed anyone." So he kept his answers very general. And they also talked to some extent about how the photographs taken of his private parts did not correspond to the description given by Jordan Chandler, but again, without naming him. And it was in direct response to a question, and it was within an interview that was about many things, not just the case. So just bear this in mind when we get to the end, when I talk about how this was handled by Evan. All right, that's it. Back to the video. Clause 11 deals with the confidentiality aspect of the settlement and how the parties may behave in the future and how they're restricted as a result of the settlement. So I won't go into too much detail. It is quite lengthy, and it's just sufficient to understand that this is all about the confidentiality and not talking about this in public. And if you do, then you will be in breach of the settlement conditions. So specifically in clause 11B and D, both parties can make no further allegations or statements against Michael Jackson pertaining to Jordan or anyone else. Clause G states that they can't respond to subpoenas or requests for information from anyone investigating Michael Jackson in an unrelated case until they inform Michael Jackson's attorneys in writing, unless their response is a refusal or objection. Now, this one's interesting because I'm sure it kicked in the 2005 trial, because we know that June Chandler was summoned. She did testify, and so I do wonder whether she had to reach out to Michael's attorneys and get their permission to respond. It was a criminal case, though, so again, this is where my lack of practical experience will show. I don't know whether this specific clause applies to subpoenas and requests for information in criminal cases. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. If someone knows for certain, then of course you can let us know in the comments. All right, that's pretty much it for the settlement. My goal with this video was really to clarify to everyone that signing a settlement is not an admission of guilt. It is perhaps one of the most common myths surrounding legal cases such as this one. You can't pay off a victim's silence legally. You can do it, of course, as I said, if the victim doesn't know any better, but it's not legally sound. And I really wanted to convey that because people are so sure when they present their opposing arguments to me, or when I'm reading or watching things online, they're so certain of Michael's guilt purely because of this settlement. What we need to understand is, as I stated in my first video, part 1, Michael was under pressure at this point. He was about to give a deposition, therefore unveiling his defense to the prosecution, because the prosecution was completely separate to the civil case. They were investigating the criminal one, but then they would have had first row seats to Michael's defense. Another important factor, apart from the prosecution getting access to Michael's defense, is also the possibility of tainting the jury pool. If a civil trial goes first, obviously it's going to be publicized. It's Michael Jackson. And then that would really risk tainting the jury pool. So the pool of people from which the jury would eventually be selected for a criminal trial, which never happened anyway. But at that point, when Michael was in that tight spot and the pressure of, do I settle or do I go ahead with this and risk my right to a fair trial? At that point, no one knew that the criminal investigation would not proceed further. No one knew that the grand jury would not indict Michael because of a lack of evidence. People are focusing on Michael's intentions behind the settlement. But no one ever stops to wonder why the Chandlers insisted on settling this case outside of court. They never pursued a criminal investigation. They didn't even really cooperate with the authorities, especially after this settlement was signed. Nothing stopped them from signing this settlement and still continuing with a criminal investigation. Now, it's not in their hands as civilians to do that, but they could have cooperated and forced the issue. You would think that parents of an allegedly abused minor would take the money, but then go, okay, now, but we want to see justice done. Now, back to the issue I raised of people focusing on why Michael settled instead of focusing on why the Chandlers did. Let's talk about that. Why did they settle? Now, they apparently state that they did it to move on and so that they wouldn't subject Jordan to the media spotlight and scrutiny that would have been unavoidable in a high-profile case. And they also claim that they apparently received several death threats from Michael's fans and that the LA district attorney at the time refused to put the family in witness protection. It's interesting that they say that, though, because 2 days after the settlement was signed, Ray Chandler was shopping around for his book, for someone to publish his book, which we all know now is All That Glitters, published in 2004.
This is Judith Regan, and I have a very interesting story to tell about Jordan Chandler's uncle. Within days of Jordan Chandler and his family settling his 1993 lawsuit against Michael Jackson, I received a call from Jordan's uncle. He wanted to do a book in which he would describe in detail the allegation of molestation against Michael Jackson. So I asked him how he proposed to do this, given the fact that the Chandlers had actually signed a confidentiality agreement and taken $20 million, and he said that Jordan's father had given him all the information he needed for the book, and he believed it was outside the bounds of the confidentiality agreement because he would be the author. At the time, I had the impression that the Chandlers were brazen opportunists, and I found the entire proposal by the uncle to be distasteful. They enter a confidentiality agreement, and before the ink is even dry, they're shopping a deal that violates that agreement?
That doesn't seem to align with the actions of a family that are concerned about the welfare of their minor child and also just wanted to move on. You clearly wanted to profit from this case, even after the settlement was made. Now, some people may argue Ray Chandler was the uncle, he was Evan's brother, he is far removed or whatnot, but Evan Chandler himself decided to try to sue Michael because of this interview that he had with Lisa Marie Presley, in which he basically stated he never did anything wrong.
Did you ever, as this young boy said you did you ever sexually engage, fondle, have sexual contact with this child or any other child?
Never, ever. I could never harm a child or anyone. It's not in my heart. It's not who I am. And it's not what I'm not even interested in that.
And what do you think should be done to someone who does that?
To someone who does that, what I think it should be done, gee, I think they need help in some kind of way, you know?
And so Evan said, that's in breach of the settlement. I'm going to come after you. And he wanted $60 million out of Michael and a record deal in which he wanted to release this album called Evan's Story in response to History, released by Michael. It's absolutely insane. It's just crazy. The case was actually dismissed in 2000. I have linked everything in the description box as per usual. As I expected, of course, I did receive comments in the last video accusing me of being biased, even though I specifically stated that I came into this with no preconceived notions, no particular loyalty to anyone, no sides that I was favoring, absolutely nothing. I examined the facts and the evidence, and I arrived at my conclusion based on my analysis. It could be anyone in Michael's shoes, and I would have arrived at the exact same conclusion, because it's not about Michael Jackson. It's about the facts and the evidence. It's the same approach I take with Johnny Depp, with Meghan Markle, with anyone I talk about. Other than that, don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for all the support. Don't forget to share this video on your preferred social media platform. It will really help spread the word. Thank you all for watching. A very warm and special thank you to my patrons. Stay safe, everyone, and I will catch you in a future video.